Now let's turn to crime. Among the most firmly established facts about criminal offenders is that their distribution of IQ scores differs from that of the population at large. Taking the scientific literature as a whole, criminal offenders have average IQs of about 92, 8 points below the mean. More serious or chronic offenders generally have lower scores than more casual offenders. The relationship of IQ to criminality is especially pronounced in the small fraction of the population, primarily young men, who constitute the chronic criminals that account for a disproportionate amount of crime. Offenders who have been caught do not score much lower, if at all, than those who are getting away with their crimes. Holding socioeconomic status constant does little to explain away the relationship between crime and cognitive ability. High intelligence also provides some protection against lapsing into criminality for people who are otherwise at risk. Those who have grown up in turbulent homes, have parents who are themselves criminal, or who exhibited the childhood traits that presage crime are less likely to become criminals as adults if they have high IQ. What is the logic that might lead us to expect low intelligence to be more frequently linked with criminal tendencies than high intelligence is? One chain of reasoning starts from the observation that low intelligence often translates into failure and frustration in school and in the job market. If, for example, people of low intelligence have a hard time finding a job, they might have more reason to commit crimes as a way of making a living. If people of low intelligence have a hard time acquiring status through the ordinary ways, crime might seem like a good alternative route. At the least, their failures in school and at work may foster resentment toward society and its laws. Perhaps the link between crime and low IQ is even more direct. A lack of foresight, which is often associated with low IQ, raises the attractions of the immediate gains from crime and lowers the strengths of the deterrents which come later if they come at all. To a person of low intelligence, the threats of apprehension and prison may fade to meaninglessness. They are too abstract, too far in the future, too uncertain. Low IQ may be part of a broader complex of factors: an appetite for danger, a stronger-than-average hunger for the things that you can get only by stealing if you cannot buy them, an antipathy toward conventionality, an insensitivity to pain or to social ostracism, and a host of derangements of various sorts, combined with low IQ, may set the stage for a criminal career. Finally, there are moral considerations. Perhaps the ethical principles for not committing crimes are less accessible or less persuasive to people of low intelligence. They find it harder to understand why robbing someone is wrong, find it harder to appreciate the values of civil and cooperative social life, and accordingly are less inhibited from acting in ways that are hurtful to other people and to the community at large. By now, you will already be anticipating the usual caution. Despite the relationship of low IQ to criminality, the great majority of people with low cognitive ability are law-abiding. We will also take this opportunity to note that the increase in crime over the last 30 years, like the increases in illegitimacy and welfare, cannot be attributed to changes in intelligence, but rather must be blamed on other factors which may have put people of low cognitive ability at greater risk than before. In trying to understand how to deal with the crime problem, much of the attention now given to problems of poverty and unemployment should be shifted to another question altogether: coping with cognitive disadvantage. We will return to this question later when we consider policy changes that might make it easier for everyone to live within the law. Thus far, we have taken on social behaviors one at a time, focusing on causal roles, with the analysis restricted to whites. Now we turn to the national scene. This means considering all races and ethnic groups, which leads to the most controversial issues we will discuss. These are ethnic differences in cognitive ability and social behavior, the effects of fertility patterns on the distribution of intelligence, and the overall relationship of low cognitive ability to what has become known as the underclass. Despite the forbidding air that envelops the topic, ethnic differences in cognitive ability are neither surprising nor in doubt. Large human populations differ in many ways, both cultural and biological. It is not surprising that they might differ at least slightly in their cognitive characteristics. That they do is confirmed by the data on ethnic differences in cognitive ability from around the world. Such differences are real and have consequences, but the facts are not as alarming as many people seem to fear. Here is a summary of our findings. East Asians, that is, Chinese and Japanese, whether in America or in Asia, typically earn higher test scores on intelligence and achievement tests than white Americans. The precise size of their advantage is unclear. Estimates range from just a few to 10 points. A more certain difference between the races is that East Asians have higher nonverbal intelligence than whites, while being equal, or perhaps slightly lower, in verbal intelligence. Turning to blacks and whites, a difference of approximately 15 IQ points has been observed since intelligence tests began. Attempts to explain the difference in terms of test bias have failed. The tests have approximately equal predictive force for whites and blacks. In the past few decades, the gap between blacks and whites narrowed by perhaps 3 IQ points. The narrowing appears to have been mainly caused by a shrinking number of very low scores in the black population rather than an increasing number of high scores. Improvements in the economic circumstances of blacks, in the quality of the schools they attend, in better public health, and perhaps also diminishing racism may be narrowing the gap. The debate about whether and how much genes and environment have to do with ethnic differences remains unresolved. The main point, however, is not who will eventually turn out to be right, but that the answer makes no practical difference in how individuals deal with each other. The real danger is that the elite wisdom on ethnic differences, that such differences cannot exist, will shift to opposite and equally unjustified extremes. Open and informed discussion is the one certain way to protect society from the dangers of one extreme view or the other. Now for a more detailed analysis. Ethnic differences in measured cognitive ability have been found throughout the century and in many parts of the world. The battle over the meaning of these differences is largely responsible for today's controversy over intelligence testing itself. Our primary purpose is to lay out a set of statements, as precise as the state of knowledge permits, about what is currently known about the size, nature, validity, and persistence of ethnic differences on measures of cognitive ability. A secondary purpose is to try to induce clarity in ways of thinking about ethnic differences, for discussions about such differences tend to run away with themselves, blending issues of fact, theory, ethics, and public policy that need to be separated. The first thing to remember is that the differences among individuals are far greater than the differences between groups. If all the ethnic differences in intelligence evaporated overnight, most of the intellectual variation in America would endure. The remaining inequality would still strain the political process because differences in cognitive ability are problematic even in ethnically homogeneous societies. But the politics of cognitive inequality get hotter, sometimes too hot to handle, when they are attached to the politics of ethnicity. We believe that the best way to keep the temperature down is to work through the main facts carefully and methodically. We frequently use the word ethnic rather than race because race is such a difficult concept to employ in the American context. What does it mean to be black in America, in racial terms, when the word black or African American can be used for people whose ancestry is more European than African? How are we to classify a person whose parents hail from Panama but whose ancestry is predominantly African? Is he a Latino? A black? The rule we follow here is to classify people according to the way they classify themselves. The studies of blacks or Latinos or Asians who live in America generally denote people who say they are black, Latino, or Asian, no more, no less. This prompts a second point to be understood at the outset. There are differences between races, and they are the rule, not the exception. That assertion may seem controversial to some listeners, but it verges on tautology. Races are by definition groups of people who differ in characteristic ways. Intellectual fashion has dictated that all differences must be denied except the absolutely undeniable differences in appearance, but nothing in biology says this should be so. On the contrary, race differences are varied and complex, and they make the human species more adaptable and more interesting. So much for preliminaries. Answers to commonly asked questions will follow, beginning with the basics and moving into successively more complicated issues. The black-white difference receives by far the most detailed examination because it is the most controversial and has the widest social ramifications. But the most common question we have been asked in recent years has not been about blacks, but about Asians, as Americans have watched the spectacular economic success of the Pacific Rim nations at a distance, and, closer to home, become accustomed to seeing Asian immigrant children collecting top academic honors in America's schools. This leads to our first question. Do Asians have higher IQs than whites? The answer is probably yes, If Asian refers to the Japanese and Chinese, and perhaps also Koreans, whom we refer to here as East Asians. How much higher is still unclear. In our judgment, the balance of the evidence supports the proposition that the overall East Asian mean is higher than the white mean. If we had to put a number on it, 3 IQ points currently most resembles a consensus, tentative though it still is. Next question. Do blacks score differently from whites on standardized tests of cognitive ability? If the samples are chosen to be representative of the American population, the answer has been yes for every known test of cognitive ability that meets basic psychometric standards of reliability and validity. The answer is also yes for almost all of the studies in which the black and white samples are matched on some special characteristics, samples of juvenile delinquents, for example, or of graduate students. Of course, there are exceptions. Next question. How large is the black-white difference? The usual answer to this question is 1 standard deviation. A standard deviation is a common language for expressing test scores above and below the mean. For example, for a test distributed normally, a person whose score is 1 standard deviation below the mean is at the 16th percentile. A person whose score is 1 standard deviation above the mean is at the 84th percentile. Or, in short, as a measure of distance from the mean, 1 standard deviation means big, 2 standard deviations means very big, and 3 standard deviations means huge. In discussing IQ tests, the black mean is commonly given as 85, the white mean as 100, and 1 standard deviation as 15. Translated into centiles, this means that the average white person tests higher than about 84% of the population of blacks, and that the average black person tests higher than about 16% of the population of whites. A difference of this magnitude should be thought of in several ways. Recall first that the American black population numbers more than 30 million people. Of those, about 100,000 people have IQs of 125 or higher. 100,000 is a lot of people. It should be no surprise to see, as one does every day, blacks functioning at high levels in every intellectually challenging field. It is important to understand as well that a difference of 1 standard deviation means considerable overlap in the cognitive ability distribution for blacks and whites. For any equal number of blacks and whites, a large proportion have IQs that can be matched up. This is the distribution to keep in mind whenever thinking about individuals. But an additional complication has to be taken into account. In the United States, there are about 6 whites for every black. At the lower end of the IQ range, there are approximately equal numbers of blacks and whites, but throughout the upper half of the range, the disproportions between the numbers of whites and blacks at any given IQ level are huge. To the extent that the difference represents an authentic difference in cognitive functioning, the social consequences are potentially huge as well. But is the difference authentic? Are differences in black and white test scores attributable instead to cultural bias or other artifacts of the test? We'll examine this question in 2 ways. First, we'll look for external evidence of bias. Tests are used to predict things, most commonly to predict performance in school or on the job. To use a concrete example, the SAT is used as a tool in college admissions because it has a certain validity in predicting college performance. If the SAT is biased against blacks, it will underpredict their college performance. If tests were biased in this way, blacks as a group would do better in college than the admissions office expected based just on their SATs. It would be as if the test underestimated the true SAT score of the blacks, so the natural remedy for this kind of bias would be to compensate the black applicants by, for example, adding the appropriate number of points onto their scores. This type of predictive bias can work in another way, as when the test is simply less reliable, that is, less accurate, for blacks than for whites. Suppose a test used to select police sergeants is more accurate in predicting the performance of white candidates who become sergeants than in predicting the performance of black sergeants. It doesn't underpredict for blacks, but rather fails to predict at all or predicts less accurately. In these cases, the natural remedy would be to give less weight to the test scores of blacks than to those of whites. A key concept for both types of bias is the same. A test biased against blacks does not predict black performance in the real world in the same way that it predicts white performance in the real world. The evidence of bias is external, in the sense that it shows up in differing validities for blacks and whites. External evidence of bias has been sought in hundreds of studies. It has been evaluated relative to performance in elementary school, in secondary school, in the university, in the armed forces, in unskilled and skilled jobs, and in the professions. Overwhelmingly, the evidence is that the major standardized tests used to help make school and job decisions do not underpredict black performance, nor does the expert community find any other general or systematic difference in the predictive accuracy of tests for blacks and whites. Now let's examine internal evidence of bias. Predictive validity is the ultimate criterion for bias because it involves the proof of the pudding for any test. But although predictive validity is in a technical sense the decisive issue, our impression from talking about this issue with colleagues and friends is that other types of potential bias loom larger in their imaginations. These are the many things that are put under the umbrella label of cultural bias. The most common charges of cultural bias involve the putative cultural loading of items in a test. Here is an SAT analogy item that has become famous as an example of cultural bias. Runner is to marathon as, envoy is to embassy, martyr is to massacre, oarsman is to regatta, referee is to tournament, or horse is to stable. The answer is oarsman to regatta. Fairly easy if you know what both a marathon and a regatta are, a matter of guesswork otherwise. How would a black youngster from the inner city ever have heard of a regatta? Many view such items as proof that the test must be biased against people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Clearly, writes a critic of testing, citing this example, this item does not measure students' aptitude or logical reasoning ability, but knowledge of upper-middle-class recreational activity. In effect, the SAT critic is saying that culturally loaded items are producing at least some of the black-white difference. Get rid of such items, and the gap will narrow. Is he correct? When we look at the results for items that have answers such as oarsman regatta, and the results for items that seem to be empty of any cultural information, such as repeating a sequence of numbers, are there any differences? Are differences in group test scores concentrated among certain items? The technical literature is again clear. In study after study of the leading tests, the hypothesis that the black-white difference is caused by questions with cultural content has been contradicted by the facts. Items that the average white test taker finds easy relative to other items, the average black test taker does too. The same is true for items that the average white and black find difficult. Inasmuch as whites and blacks have different overall scores on the average, it follows that a smaller proportion of blacks get right answers for either easy or hard items, but the order of difficulty is virtually the same in each racial group. For groups that have special language considerations, Latinos and American Indians, for example, some internal evidence of bias has been found, unless English is their native language. Studies comparing blacks and whites on various kinds of IQ tests find that the black-white difference is not created by items that ask about regattas or who wrote Hamlet, or any of the other similar examples cited in criticisms of tests. How can this be? The explanation is complicated and goes deep into the reasons why a test item is good or bad in measuring intelligence. Here, we restrict ourselves to the conclusion. The black-white difference is wider on items that appear to be culturally neutral than on items that appear to be culturally loaded. This point is well established empirically, yet comes as a surprise to most people who are new to this topic. In any case, there is no longer an important technical debate over the conclusion that the cultural content of test items is not the cause of group differences in scores. Another issue that demands investigation can best be described as the motivation to try. Suppose that the nature of cultural bias does not lie in predictive validity or in the content of the items, but in what might be called test willingness. A typical black youngster, it is hypothesized, comes to such tests with a mindset different from the white subjects. He is less attuned to testing situations, from one point of view, or less inclined to put up with such nonsense from another. Perhaps he just doesn't give a damn since he has no hopes of going to college or otherwise benefiting from a good test score. Perhaps he figures that the test is biased against him anyway, so what's the point? Perhaps he consciously refuses to put out his best effort because of the peer pressures against acting white in some inner-city schools. Despite these suppositions, however, the studies that have attempted to measure motivation in such situations have generally found that blacks are at least as motivated as whites. Other kinds of bias include the possibility that blacks have less access to coaching than whites, less experience with tests, poorer understanding of standard English, and that their performance is affected by white examiners. Each of these hypotheses has been investigated for many tests under many conditions. None has been sustained. In short, the testable hypotheses have led toward the conclusion that cognitive ability tests are not biased against blacks. This leaves one final hypothesis regarding cultural bias that does not lend itself to empirical evaluation, at least not directly. It is called uniform background bias. Suppose our society is so steeped in the conditions that produce test bias that people in disadvantaged groups score below their cognitive abilities on all the items on tests, thereby hiding the internal evidence of bias. At the same time, and for the same reasons, they underperform in school and on the job in relation to their true abilities, thereby hiding the external evidence. In other words, the tests may be biased against disadvantaged groups, but the traces of bias are invisible because the bias permeates all areas of the group's performance. To some listeners, this hypothesis will seem so plausible that it is self-evidently correct. Before deciding that this must be the explanation for group differences in test scores, however, let's look more closely. The hypothesis implies that many of the performance yardsticks in the society at large are not only biased, they are all so similar in the degree to which they distort the truth in every occupation, every type of educational institution, every achievement measure, every performance measure, that no differential distortion is picked up by the data. Is this plausible? It is not good enough to accept without question that a general background radiation of bias, uniform and ubiquitous, explains away black and white differences in test scores and performance measures. The hypothesis might, in theory, be true. But given the degree to which everyday experience suggests that the environment confronting blacks in different sectors of American life is not uniformly hostile, and given the consistency in results from a wide variety of cognitive measures, assuming that the hypothesis is true represents a considerably longer leap of faith than the much more limited assumption that race prejudice is still a factor in American life. Finally, are the differences in overall black and white test scores attributable to differences in socioeconomic status? This question has two different answers depending on how the question is understood, and confusion is rampant. We will take up the two answers and their associated rationales separately. First version. If you extract the effects of socioeconomic class, what happens to the overall magnitude of the black-white difference? Blacks are disproportionately in the lower socioeconomic classes, and socioeconomic class is known to be associated with IQ. Therefore, many people suggest, part of what appears to be an ethnic difference in IQ scores is actually a socioeconomic difference. The answer to this version of the question is that the size of the gap shrinks when socioeconomic status is statistically extracted. The trouble is that socioeconomic status is also a result of cognitive ability, as people of high and low cognitive ability move to correspondingly high and low places in the socioeconomic continuum. The reason that parents have high or low socioeconomic status is, in part, a function of their intelligence, and their intelligence also affects the IQ of their children via both genes and environment. Second version. As blacks move up the socioeconomic ladder, do the differences with whites of similar socioeconomic status diminish? The rationale goes like this. Blacks score lower on average because they are socioeconomically at a disadvantage in our society. This disadvantage should most seriously handicap the children of blacks in the lower socioeconomic classes, who suffer from greater barriers to education and occupational advancement than do the children of blacks in the middle and upper classes. As blacks advance up the socioeconomic ladder, their children, less exposed to these environmental deficits, will do better and, by extension, close the gap with white children of their class. This expectation is not borne out by the data. IQ scores increase with economic status for both races, but the magnitude of the black-white difference in standard deviations does not decrease. Indeed, it gets larger as people move up from the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. This brings us to the flashpoint of intelligence as a public topic, the question of genetic differences between the races. Expert opinion, when it is expressed at all, diverges widely, and there is a great degree of uncertainty within the scientific community about where the truth lies. We have considered leaving the genetics issue at that, on grounds that no useful purpose is served by talking about a subject that is so inflammatory, so painful, and so far from resolution. We could have cited any number of expert reassurances that genetic differences among ethnic groups are not worth worrying about. And yet, people who call themselves Japanese or Xhosa or Caucasians or Maori can still differ intellectually for genetic reasons. We may call them ethnic groups instead of races if we wish, but some ethnic groups nonetheless differ genetically for sure, otherwise they would not have differing skin colors or hair textures or muscle mass. They also differ intellectually on the average. The question remaining is whether the intellectual differences overlap the genetic differences to any extent. Our reason for confronting the issue of genetic cognitive differences is not to quarrel with those who deny them. If the question of genetic differences in cognitive ability were something that only professors argued about among themselves, we would happily ignore it here. We cannot do so because, in the public discussion of genes and intelligence, no burden of proof at all is placed on the innumerable public commentators who claim that racial differences in intelligence are purely environmental. This sometimes leads to the next statement, that the differences are therefore inauthentic, and that public policy must be measured against the assumption that there are no genuine cognitive differences between the races. The assumption of genetic cognitive equality among the races has practical consequences that require us to confront the assumption directly. We have further become convinced that the topic of genes, intelligence, and race in the late 20th century is like the topic of sex in Victorian England. Publicly, there seems to be nothing to talk about. Privately, people are fascinated by it. As the gulf widens between public discussion and private opinion, confusion and error flourish. As it was true of sex then, so it is true of ethnic differences in intelligence now. Taboos breed not only ignorance, but misinformation. The dangers of the misinformation are compounded by the nature of the contemporary discussion of race. Just beneath the surface of American life, people talk about race in ways that bear little resemblance to the politically correct public discussion, conducted in the workplace, dorm rooms, taverns, and country clubs, by people in every ethnic group. This dialogue is troubled and often accusatory. The underground conversation is not limited to a racist minority. It goes on everywhere, and we believe it is increasingly shaped by privately held beliefs about the implications of genetic differences that could not stand open inspection.